Good morning. This is a day off for me because of Veterans Day, so I have several shorter topics that I want to address if possible. But in this video, I'd like to address a little bit more lengthy topic, and that is what was referred to by Witness Lee as the first rebellion in the 80s, or maybe the first rebellion in the United States of a church. And he was referring to Rosemead. And I'd like to just read some facts about that rebellion. So firstly, I would like to just share where this claim comes from that the first rebellion took place in Rosemead. This is from the Fermentation of the Present Rebellion's preface, written by Witness Lee. And it is quoted as saying, "The first rebellion took place in Rosemead in September 1987. Daniel Chu told David Dong on September 27th, 1987, that they, Brother Daniel and those with him, had a global connection and that some of the leading co-workers in the recovery were meeting or were going to meet together, and there would be a communique in a week or two. By this he meant that the ones in Rosemead were not the only ones who were rebelling. There were also others. This also indicates there was also a conspiracy. During this time, Joseph Chu, Daniel Chu, and those agreeing with them strongly condemned all efforts to have fellowship as interference and began to isolate themselves from other churches around the area." There are other representations of the rebellion in Rosemead, which I grew up, or I was a teenager during this time, and I would hear about the rebellion in Rosemead and how Rosemead rebelled against the ministry. But no one, or very few people, were given the facts. And I would just like to read this. Since it is said that Rosemead is where the first rebellion took place, a comparison of the official word, meaning what was printed by the Living Stream Ministry about their rebellion, a comparison of that official word about the rebellion should be made with the other side of the story as given by elders and responsible ones in that locality. The judgment against Rosemead was a microcosm of the judgment meted out to others later, I would say in the late 80s, in more widespread condemnation of rebellious ones. And those would be John Ingalls, Joseph Fung, John So, and Bill Mallon. But Rosemead kind of is said to have been the first rebellion in that accusation of rebellion. The judgment against Rosemead was a microcosm of the judgment meted out to others later in a more widespread condemnation of rebellious ones, said to have brought division into the Lord's recovery. It is therefore important to determine what really happened in Rosemead, because a graphic portrait is given of the driving wedge of division by outside sources into that local church that became the pattern for division that followed in other churches at that time, as well as today. So in 1986, Don Hardy was an elder in the church in Rosemead. And by the way, the church in Rosemead was the remnant. It began as the remnant of people in LA who did not move from Eldon Hall to Orange County. And so Rosemead was a very early church in the history of the local churches who followed Witness Lee in the U.S. But in 1986, an incident forced Don Hardy out of eldership by a 5-man committee without any explanation. In October of 1987, David Wang, an elder there, wrote that up to now, October 11th, 1987, there has been no explanation of why Don Hardy was forced to leave Rosemead. The sweet coordination and oneness was destroyed, and the church was damaged. Don Hardy was one of the elders in Rosemead and also served the Lord as a co-worker for over 20 years. In March 1986, he was forced to leave Rosemead by a 5-man committee for an unknown reason. The 5-man committee was set up as a result of John Quan going to Anaheim to accuse Don Hardy. Afterwards, none of the 5 men would bear the responsibility to explain the matter to the church in Rosemead. Well, what people don't necessarily know, Don Hardy put into his own words of what happened. Don Hardy was serving in the living stream, reading the New Testament recovery version on cassette tape, I believe it was at that time, and he testifies that he felt in the heavenlies doing that work, reading the New Testament. And he walked into the living stream ministry general office area after recording some of that and felt this really sickening feeling. And anyway, he went to go talk to Philip Lee and put his hand on the door, and his sister, Beverly Goyer, said, "Don't go in there." And it was too late. He opened the door, and Philip Lee was with a married sister, not his wife, in an adulterous situation. Well, Philip knew he got caught and would say, "I'm getting rid of Don Hardy." So when Don Hardy was dismissed from the eldership with no explanation, that's why there's no explanation. There was a vendetta. Philip Lee had a lot of control and was very immoral. And he got rid of Don Hardy. And eventually this cost Don Hardy's first marriage. His first wife could not take it anymore. And she already had been assaulted by Timothy Lee, I believe at least a decade earlier. And the way Witness Lee dealt with that was just to move them to the Bay Area from Eldon Hall area. So here they are back in Rosemead in the 80s, and Don Hardy sees Philip Lee committing adultery and is dismissed again. Okay. But there are other claims that the brothers in Rosemead were not one with the ministry in the matter of the new way. And I would like to read some of those details. This is still by Brother David Wang, his testimony, who was an elder there at that time. By the way, the 5-man committee to remove Don Hardy consisted of Minoru Chen and Francis Ball, and then 3 brothers who afterward apologized to Don Hardy, one of them tearfully apologizing to the whole church in Rosemead. And so David Wang did not expose their names because he said for the sake of gaining these brothers. But John Quan, who had gone to the living stream to get fellowship, personal fellowship, about the resistance, what he perceived as a resistance to the new way in the church in Rosemead, was the catalyst for this 5-man committee that removed Don Hardy with no explanation. So Minoru Chen, who had been on that committee, gave a testimony in Anaheim concerning the rebellion of Rosemead, and this was printed in the Fermentation of the Present Rebellion, page 111. And this is just a little bit of an excerpt. I would like to talk about the case related to Rosemead. In the summer training of 1987, we baptized 3,700 people. If it was not for these brothers instigating this turmoil to cause the saints to lose heart, I believe that many of these ones would have come into the church life. This is the enemy's work to undermine the new way. Okay, Minoru knew that 5-man committee of brothers who unrighteously removed their leading elder, Don Hardy, caused the church in Rosemead to lose heart. Witness Lee told Don Hardy in a personal conversation in the home of Witness Lee that it was wrong what those brothers did to remove him. Brother Lee added he never heard of such a thing being done in all his years in the recovery. This was the undermining of the eldership in the church in Rosemead, and it says the undermining of the headship of Christ in Rosemead. Francis Ball, who was also present at Don Hardy's removal, took Don's place in the eldership and continued the undermining work of the Lord's headship of the local church in Rosemead. The saints, however, rejected what Minoru and Francis had done and what Francis was doing, which was basically to push the new way down the throat of the elders and saints, thus upsetting the whole church and fueling a turmoil among them. The church in Rosemead showed their displeasure by expelling Francis Ball from Rosemead. Minoru also shared, I took the lead to propose that we have a gospel preaching festival in the San Gabriel Valley where many Chinese-speaking people reside. We fellowshipped with Brother Lee, with the co-workers, and with the church in Rosemead about this. In particular, we fellowshipped with one of the main elders, David Wang, in the church in Rosemead. He was actually the one who strongly agreed we should have this festival in the San Gabriel Valley. He wanted us to work there and to help gain a breakthrough in the gospel among the Chinese. The facilities of the church in Rosemead were opened up for the use of that festival. Later, there were accusations that the ministry went there to take over the church and do things there. This is absolutely a lie. We were in fellowship with the church there. David Wang was in full coordination with us on a weekly basis. In fact, he was one of the ones who handled the financial matters related to that festival. So David Wang says, true, it was agreed upon by John Quan, Joseph Chu, and myself. But during the 10 days or so that followed, in dozens of big and small meetings, the brothers responsible for the door-knocking training or that gospel festival used inflammatory remarks, revolutionary terms, and uttered nonsense. The damage they brought to the church was beyond our wildest dreams. Some of the trainers' remarks in that door-knocking training were as follows, I quote, "Success of revolution depends on propaganda. To take the new way, we need to learn from the communists in their propaganda techniques. The way of propaganda is through the clever use of our tongues." Another quote, "We need to learn from the Red Guards. Even we need to learn from Satan. For whenever God wants to work, Satan is always one step ahead." Another quote, "The new way requires no prayers. The more you pray, the more confused you are. Just follow the instructions and do it. You'll be all right." Another quote, "At the end of 1987, we'll have 10 new churches set up in the San Gabriel Valley to present to Brother Lee as a present to please him. Even though he says he does not want people to elevate him, actually in his heart he likes us to do it. Therefore, just go ahead and do it. This is the secret I have learned in the past years." Another quote, "We need to squeeze money out of brothers and sisters, for where their treasure is, there will their heart be also." David Wang continues, "Several saints who were originally from mainland China privately expressed that this kind of leading resembled the communists. It brought them back to nightmare scenes of the past. One Lord's Day morning, after 10 days of gospel blitz," and blitz is a Nazi term commonly used for door knocking, and yeah, we had blitzes, yeah. And it did bring back thoughts of Nazi Germany for me too. Anyway, one Lord's Day morning, after 10 days of gospel blitz, 2 men came to the meeting hall. They wanted to see the person in charge. First, they wanted to ascertain if there was indeed a church. Second, they wished to protest the disturbance the door knockers brought to their community. After I explained and apologized, they left. Later, I found out that one of the men had pulled out a gun and chased the door knockers from his home. It is true. We opened the door and willingly let brothers use the meeting hall. Our initial intention was pure and simple, to spread the gospel and lead people to salvation. But today, after almost 2 years, my personal feeling is that we let in wolves, causing great damage to the church. So I'm going to just pause there, but These details of Don Hardy seeing Philip Lee committing adultery in the Living Stream Ministry office and then getting removed with no explanation to his church, and then the details of why brothers would start having a resistance to a gospel work that is using these inflammatory words in training the saints to door knock. These need to be included in an account of some first rebellion in the Lord's recovery. And I thought of this and wanted to read this particularly because several people in the comments of videos recently have been mentioning propaganda and how similar some of these patterns are in the local church to communist tactics. And that is actually that's not a coincidence. It was even taught by trainers to use propaganda as the communists used propaganda. Thank you for listening.